All okay? Sorry, they hadn't turned it on. If you have a class, please go to that class. I know economics is fun. It is taped. You won't miss out. Now, we started off the semester with a basic model of the economy. Economics is about scarcity. We want to answer 3 questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. We assumed that there were just 2 goods that we could produce. I'll try and stick with the same examples. It was pizza versus cola. If we use all our resources to produce pizza, we would produce no cola. If we use all our resources to produce cola, we would produce no pizza. So we have 2 extremes in terms of the amount of cola and amount of pizza we can produce. We can't produce infinite quantities of either because resources are limited, resources are finite. Now, connecting the 2 extremes would give us the production possibility curve, production possibility frontier. It can be a straight line, but it's more realistically actually concave to the origin. The reason it's concave is because not all resources are equally adaptable to the production of both goods, both products. Some goods are really good at making cola. Some resources are really good at making cola. Some resources are really good at making pizza. So the production possibilities curve, production possibilities frontier ends up having this curved shape. If I start off only making cola and I want to start making some pizza, I would take away the resources that are not as productive in making cola, but they're quite productive at making pizza. So the gain in pizza is very large, but the loss in cola is very small. If I'm only making pizza at the moment and I want to start making cola, I'll take away whatever resource is not productive in making pizza, but is very productive in making cola. So the production possibilities tends to be quite steep towards the x-axis. So it starts off very flat and ends up very steep. It is called the law of increasing opportunity cost. As you move from left to right, the opportunity cost begins to increase. If the resources were equally adaptable to making both goods, then the production possibilities would have been a nice straight line. But because resources aren't equally adaptable to making both products, the production possibilities ends up having a concave shape. It's called the law of increasing opportunity cost. Now, we use that, don't worry, you won't have 6 graphs. We use that to construct our marginal cost curve. Now, assuming that there are only 2 goods, let's construct the cost of producing pizza in terms of cola. As you move from left to right, the marginal cost of producing pizza begins to increase. I have to sacrifice more and more cola to increase the production of pizza. Every single point on the production possibilities curve is productively efficient, but not every single point is allocatively efficient. So if I'm on the production possibilities curve, I am utilizing all of my resources, but I may not be producing exactly what society wants. Every single point is a possibility, Our aim is now to find which point the society actually wants. For that, you compare the marginal cost to the marginal benefits. In this, you're measuring marginal benefit, you're measuring marginal cost in terms of the other good that is being produced. Marginal benefit is always decreasing. The first slice of pizza gives you a lot of extra happiness. You're hungry, so you eat the first slice, you gain a lot of happiness. The second one, well, you've already had one slice to eat, so the second one's marginal benefit is not as great as the first one. So the marginal benefit curve is downward sloping. That is the law of diminishing marginal utility. So marginal cost is upward sloping, law of increasing opportunity cost. Marginal benefit is downward sloping, law of diminishing marginal utility. And where the marginal benefits and the marginal cost are equal, we call that allocative efficiency. That is the amount of pizza that is optimum for society to produce. Now, like I said, every single point on the production possibilities is possible. We can't choose every single point, we must choose only one. A movement from point to point, we will sacrifice one good for the other. Now our decision is which point does society actually want. You compare the marginal benefit to the marginal cost, and so we should be producing on that point of the PPF. Do you guys call it PPF or PPC? I forget. PPF. Production Possibility Frontier. Now, when you're producing at the allocatively efficient point, you are maximizing the total surplus for society as a whole. The difference between the marginal benefit, how much society places value on it, compared to the marginal cost, what is the cost of producing it, the allocative efficient point maximizes the total surplus. Any other point which is not allocatively efficient, if you were to produce less, you would have a smaller total surplus. If you were to produce more, well, now you're actually having some negative surplus on this side because the extra cost outweighs the extra benefit. So the best level of output for society to produce as a whole is where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Later on, we show how the marginal cost curve is the supply curve and the marginal benefit is the demand curve. So where demand meets supply is the allocative efficient point. So, later we showed how the marginal cost curve is basically the supply curve and the marginal benefit curve is basically the demand curve. Where demand and supply meet is what we call a market. The market decides the market price and the market quantity. I know this is very easy for you now. With no interference in the market and assuming no external costs, no external benefits, So let's assume external costs and external benefits are 0. If we assume there are no external costs and no external benefits, then that is actually the marginal social cost, and that is actually the marginal social benefit. And that point is allocatively efficient. We'll see what happens when we have external costs and external benefits. Now, the triangle on top is the consumer surplus. Why? Demand is what you're willing to pay, but you actually end up paying less. Supply is how producers are willing to sell, but they actually end up getting a higher price. So the triangle below represents producer surplus. The triangle above represents consumer surplus. With no externalities, either cost-wise or benefit-wise, the market produces the largest possible total surplus. If there are no externalities, without government intervention, the market actually gives society as a whole the largest possible total surplus, combination of consumer and producer. The government may interfere with this market. They might impose a price ceiling. If it is an effective price ceiling, it will be below the equilibrium market price. Why might the government impose a price ceiling? They might feel the product's price is too high, so the government interferes with the market. And what the government ends up actually doing is, the government is trying to enforce a legal maximum price, but the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. Even though consumers are actually wanting more, producers are not actually willing to sell more. So what ends up happening is, that's what ends up being traded. The rest is just excess demand. So the government is trying to reduce the price, but actually what happens is they end up making consumers worse off because producers aren't willing to sell as much compared to the equilibrium price. So what ends up happening is, the government actually ends up giving a smaller total surplus for society as a whole. We call the loss in total surplus we use the term dead weight loss. That used to be surplus for consumers and producers, but the government has stepped in, imposed the price ceiling, interfered with the market, and created a deadweight loss. There's a loss in total surplus. Again, we're assuming no external benefits, no external costs. So when the government interferes in a market which has no external benefits, no external costs, the government actually ends up creating deadweight losses. Later we'll see where there are external benefits and where there are external costs, the government may interfere and make it better. But if there are no external benefits and costs, government interference actually makes things worse. I'll quickly draw a price floor. A price floor is a legal minimum price, such as a minimum wage. The government might feel the equilibrium price is too low, so the government might decide they want to interfere with the market and make the legal minimum price higher. But what ends up happening is the quantity demanded is lower than the quantity supplied. So the quantity that ends up being traded is again the smaller value. So whether the government imposes a price floor or whether the government imposes a price ceiling, the quantity traded actually falls. Because consumers can only buy even though producers have produced that much, consumers are only demanding this quantity. So the quantity that's exchanged between the two parties is the smaller quantity. So again, we've managed to decrease total surplus. The loss in total surplus is called a deadweight loss. Another way the government may interfere, if there are no external benefits and external costs, government imposition of a tax can also create a deadweight loss. So just to remind ourselves, there are no external costs, there are no external benefits. So the supply curve is already the marginal social cost curve. The demand curve is already the marginal social benefit curve. Imposing a per unit tax will increase the marginal cost. So it will shift that cost curve upwards. Now the new equilibrium quantity is smaller than the initial quantity. Remember, this point was already allocatively efficient. The initial market equilibrium is allocatively efficient if there are no externalities. So by imposing a tax, by imposing a per unit tax, the government is actually forcing the market to not be efficient anymore. The government is pushing the quantity downwards and thus creating a deadweight loss. The market used to be efficient as there were no externalities. So here government intervention is creating deadweight losses. So please understand the difference between a tax that creates a deadweight loss when there are no externalities. In a second, we'll look at a tax might actually help eliminate deadweight losses if there are externalities. So three different ways where the government may intervene and create deadweight losses. It pushes the economy from what used to be efficient to now what is inefficient. Now, let's say we have an externality. Let's assume we have a positive external cost. If we have a positive external cost, the supply curve is actually the marginal private cost curve, and the demand curve will still be the marginal social benefit curve. There is an external cost, but the firm is ignoring it. The firm is ignoring the external cost. If we add the external costs to the marginal private cost, the marginal social cost would actually be much higher. Such as, let's say, the external cost of pollution on a third party. A factory might be creating pollution but not actually paying for it, so it's incurring an extra cost on a third party. So adding that external cost now lifts the marginal private cost to the marginal social cost. So this is actually what is efficient. The market is actually not efficient. So what the market is actually doing is going beyond the efficient point. The market is actually overproducing this product because the market is underestimating the cost. The private market is ignoring the external cost. They underestimate the cost, overproduce, and create a deadweight loss. The market is creating a deadweight loss in this case by producing beyond the efficient point. Here's an example where the government can step in and help eliminate the deadweight loss by imposing what we call a Pigovian tax. So if the government imposed a tax equal to the value of the external cost, it would internalize the cost for the firm and it would force the equilibrium to be efficient. So in the case of externalities, government intervention actually helps eliminate deadweight losses. The market is not efficient by itself. The market is ignoring the external cost. So the government imposes a tax. If the tax equals the external cost, it will force the firm to recognize that, shift it up to the marginal social cost curve, force the equilibrium to be efficient. So that there are cases where government intervention makes the market inefficient. There are cases where government intervention makes the market more efficient. In the case where the market ignores some sort of externalities. I won't draw the one for external benefit. Let's go on to something else now. So, you don't need to draw this. So we talked about the market, which is supply and demand. Let's look at how we actually got the demand curve, and let's look at how we actually got the supply curve. Demand is from the consumer's point of view. Supply is from the producer's point of view. Now, consumers demand goods based on their preferences. But what limits them is their income or their budget. Then we drew a map of preferences, assuming two goods, X and Y. As the consumer moves away from the origin, their happiness, their utility begins to increase. And we drew a series of indifference curves, where each indifference curve shows points of equal happiness. As I move away from the origin, my happiness begins to increase. What prevents me from going far away from the origin is my budget constraints. If my income is symbol I, that is the maximum amount of X I can buy, and that is the maximum amount of Y I can buy. My income divided by the price of X is the most X I can buy. My income divided by the price of Y is the most Y I can buy. My best affordable combination is where my indifference curve just touches my budget. Everything on the budget line is affordable. Everything above the budget line is not affordable. That's the best point I can afford using my given income. If the price, sorry, that's an X. If the price of one of these goods was to change, let's say the price of X decreased, the amount of Y I can afford would stay exactly the same, but the amount of X I can afford would begin to increase. So my budget would begin to rotate if the price of X went down and nothing else changed. My current combination, let's call that A, is still affordable, but it's within my budget. I'm not maximizing my happiness. I'm actually able to afford a higher level of utility. We'll just call that B. So I'm able to move to a higher indifference curve. The fall in price of X enables me to increase my utility. So using this indifference curve map, we can actually construct a consumer's demand curve. Our aim is now to see where we got the demand curve from. Demand is based on preferences and the budget constraint. Using the preferences indicated by the indifference curves and the budget constraint, I can use that information to construct a demand curve. I used to be able to buy quantity A, but now I am buying quantity B. What I'm buying is good X, and I'm looking at it in terms of the price of X. The price of X went down, the quantity of X went up. The price of X has decreased, the quantity of X has increased. So what I've got is the law of demand. A fall in the price has increased my quantity demanded. Using this information, I can construct my demand curve for good X. So where did the demand curve come from? The indifference curve map and the budget constraints showing all the best affordable points. If there is a price change, the best affordable point will also change. In this case, the price of X decreased, so the quantity of X increased. Now, that's for one consumer. If I did it for a few consumers, I'll have the demand curve for individual 1, the demand curve for individual 2, and the horizontal sum of two demand curves will give me the market demand curve, assuming that there's only two individuals in the market. So this is Mr. A, this is Mr. B, and now the market, assuming that there's just two people in the market, you horizontally add the two demand curves. You keep the price fixed and you add the quantities. So if at $1, Mr. A demands 2 and Mr. B demands 3, then the market demand will be 5. The horizontal sum of individual demand curves gives you the market demand curve. So where did the market demand curve come from? The sum of individual demand curves. Where did the individual's demand curve come from? From their best affordable bundles, just seeing what they would have bought for every possible price. That answers the question, where did the market demand come from? Let's see where the market supply comes from. Now, supply comes from the producer's point of view. Supply is the producer's willingness and ability to sell. I know you're a bit tired of writing, sorry. Just watch and enjoy. You can go home and go through it again. It's being taped. So, to see whether a producer is willing and able to sell, I'll warn you in advance, you will need 4 of these. Now, we're looking at the short run and the long run. In the short run, at least one resource is fixed, all other resources are variable. The simplest assumption is assume that capital is fixed, but labor can be varied. As I increase my labor, my output will begin to increase. So if I'm a firm, I'm trying to produce output with a fixed resource, increasing labor will increase output, but it won't increase output at a linear rate. Initially, output increases at an increasing rate. Why? Due to specialization. Then, after a certain point, output begins to increase at a decreasing rate. Why? We've got a fixed resource. Now, you've got more workers trying to crowd around a fixed machine. So the extra output begins to get smaller and smaller. Output begins to increase at a slow rate. We call that the total product curve. So the total product curve has this unusual shape, initially increasing at an increasing rate, specialization, then increasing at a decreasing rate because of our fixed resource, the capital. Now, if you invert that, you will get the variable cost of the firm. The shape of that curve also gives you the total variable cost. We'll just draw it on the side. To produce more output, it will cost me more money. My cost increases as output increases. My total variable cost curve has this particular shape. The curvature comes from the total product curve. To that, we add our fixed cost, which parallel shifts my total variable cost curve to give me the total cost curve. The vertical distance is the total fixed cost. Again, our aim is to see where in the world the supply curve came from. The supply curve is actually your marginal cost curve. So initially, cost is increasing at a decreasing rate. So your marginal cost is actually going down. Why? Because cost is increasing at a very slow rate. So your extra cost is actually falling. After a certain point, cost begins to increase at an increasing rate, so your marginal cost begins to rise. So your marginal cost curve has this J shape. Initially, cost is increasing at a decreasing rate, then cost is increasing at an increasing rate. from your tutorial questions, all marginal cost is the slope of the total cost curve. Marginal cost is U-shaped or J-shaped. Average variable cost, average total cost is also U-shaped. You just need to make sure that it turns at its minimum. The marginal cost curve above the average variable cost curve is the firm's supply curve in perfect competition. The supply curve is not the entire marginal cost curve, but the supply curve is just the portion of the marginal cost curve above average variable cost. Again, that's only for one firm. If you have another firm, firm B, firm A, and you add the two together, you get the market supply curve. The horizontal sum of individual supply curves gives you the market supply curve. Each marginal cost curve above the ABC curve is the supply of that firm. You add every single firm's supply above ABC to get the market supply. And then finally, we bring the demand and the supply together in what we call the different market structures. We looked at 4 market structures in total. The most basic is perfect competition, where the market and the firm are distinct from each other. In perfect competition, the market decides what the market price is for the firm. The firm's decision is simply how much should we sell at that market price. We call the firm a price taker. Since the price is constant, the marginal revenue is also constant, and that curve is the demand curve of the individual firm. There is a demand for the firm's product at that market price. MC equals MR tells you what quantity to produce to maximize profit. You draw the average cost curve in. If the average cost is below the market price, you have economic profits. If the average cost is above the market price, you have a loss. Perfect competition, the firm takes the price from the market. The other extreme is a monopoly, where there is no distinction between the firm and the market. The market demand curve is the firm's demand curve. The firm faces the entire market. Now, when the demand curve is downward sloping, I've done this a few times already, the marginal revenue is exactly 2 times as steep as the demand curve. When demand is downward sloping, the price is greater than MR. When I sell an extra unit, my extra revenue is not equal to price. Because demand is downward sloping, I need to reduce the price of the previous units as well. Same profit maximizing rule, MR equals MC, tells the firm how much to produce. You look at the demand curve to decide what price to charge. That is strictly a monopoly. That's the extra handout we gave you with last week's notes for monopoly. Please do the reading of that extra handout. Now, there is a special case of monopoly called a natural monopoly. Demand and MR are exactly the same for a natural monopoly, but the marginal cost curve is flat. A natural monopoly is something which has a huge fixed cost, so the fixed cost overtakes the variable cost in terms of magnitude, so the extra cost is not J-shaped anymore, it's very low and flat. Same profit maximizing rule, MR equals MC, quantity, price. The other special feature of a natural monopoly is the shape of its ATC curve is no longer U-shaped. In a natural monopoly, the ATC curve has a downward sloping shape. It looks like your average fixed cost curve. It's simply a special case of a monopoly. Back to the usual case of a monopoly. If the monopoly is making profits, economic profits, the average cost curve, it doesn't have to be in the middle there, that's just a coincidence. The average total cost curve, if it's below the price, you will have economic profits. If you have economic profits and you're a monopoly, you can keep them in the short run, you can keep them in the long run. If you're making profits. If you're making losses, you would leave in the long run. If you're making profits, no one can enter the market, you can keep those profits in the long run as well. Monopolistic competition looks similar graph-wise to monopoly in the short run, in that in monopolistic competition, your products are differentiated, so demand is not flat like in perfect competition. Demand is downward sloping like in a monopoly, but not as steep. But either way, the demand curve is downward sloping in monopolistic competition. If you have supernormal profits, if you have economic profits in the short run, monopolistic competition, you can enter the market. When new firms enter the market, if this is monopolistic competition now, if this becomes a monopolistic competition model, new firms enter the market, it does not shift supply to the right, like in perfect competition. Rather, when new firms come to the market, they steal demand from the existing firms, and the existing firms lose demand. Their demand shifts to the left. The demand curve shifts to the left until all your economic profits have disappeared. So monopolistic competition in the long run, you find that the average total cost curve hits a tangent at the demand curve. Because new firms have entered the market, they've decreased demand, the demand curve has shifted from D1 to D2. D1 used to be somewhere there. Demand keeps decreasing as new firms come in. New firms steal demand from old firms. Keeps shifting until the price and average cost are equal. So that is similar to perfect competition in the long run. The fact that price equals average cost. But there is still a markup in monopolistic competition, and there is still excess capacity in monopolistic competition compared to perfect competition. There are similarities in that the price equals average cost in the long run, but monopolistic competition, you do have a markup and you are not operating at minimum average cost. I won't go through oligopoly because you just saw that today. That's the entire course summarized in 45 minutes. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can come and see me. Other than that, have fun with the exam. Wow. The diagram is not correct. MC equals MR. Profit is here.
Oh, okay.
Always MC equals MR first. Thank you. Yes, because there's an externality, so imposing the tax actually helps the market become efficient. Otherwise, anytime the market is not efficient, government intervention can make it better. Anytime the market has no externality, government intervention makes it worse. Because the market is good by itself. Political reasons? It's beyond economics. Yeah.